The Ocean Within, Finding Peace in Life's Storms Chapter 1. The sound of rain. Amelie Bellefeuille pressed her forehead against the cool window pane, watching raindrops race down the glass in erratic patterns. The late autumn storm had been raging for 3 days now, turning the small coastal town of Port Haven into a watercolor painting of grays and blues. Her reflection stared back at her, dark circles under her eyes, honey blonde hair falling in messy waves around her face, and that same lost look she'd been carrying for months. The old Victorian house creaked around her, its wooden bones protesting against the wind. She'd inherited it from her grandmother 6 months ago, right when everything in her life had started to unravel. Now, at 28, she found herself living alone in this massive house by the sea, trying to piece together what remained of her former life. "Just breathe," she whispered to herself, fogging up the glass. Her therapist, Dr. Marina Chan, had been teaching her different grounding techniques. Focus on the present. Notice 5 things you can see. 4 things you can touch. 3 things you can hear. The rain. The distant foghorn. Her own heartbeat. Her phone buzzed on the window seat beside her, another message from Thomas. She turned it face down without reading it. After 5 years together, their relationship had dissolved like salt in the sea, leaving behind only the bitter taste of what could have been. A flash of lightning illuminated the angry waves below her cliffside home, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Amelie pulled her grandmother's old cashmere shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fabric still held traces of the lavender perfume Grandmere had always worn. Chapter 2, The Shore of Dreams. The first time Amelie saw the Shore of Dreams, she thought she was losing her mind. It happened 3 weeks after moving into the house, during another stormy night much like this one. She'd been sleeping, or thought she had been, when the sound of singing drew her down the winding staircase to the beach below. The world she stepped into wasn't quite real. The water glowed with an otherworldly phosphorescence, and the beach stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into a mysterious fog. Standing at the water's edge was a figure that looked remarkably like her grandmother, but younger, perhaps in her 20s, just as Amelie was now. "Grandmere," she'd called out, her voice carried away by the wind. The figure had turned, smiled, and held out her hand. "Close your eyes, Ami," she'd said, using the childhood nickname that only her grandmother had ever used. "Close your eyes, and you can be with me." That was the first night Amelie learned about the Shore of Dreams, a place between sleeping and waking, where the veil between past and present, reality and fantasy, grew thin enough to pass through. Chapter 3, The Caves of Memory. The caves revealed themselves gradually, like a secret the ocean wasn't sure it wanted to share. They lay beneath the cliff face, only accessible during low tide, their entrances half hidden behind curtains of seaweed and decades of erosion. Amelie discovered them during one of her early morning walks, when the pain of insomnia drove her from her bed before dawn. The tide was out further than she'd ever seen it, revealing dark openings in the rock face that seemed to beckon her forward. She should have been afraid. The rational part of her mind knew the dangers of coastal caves, sudden tides, unstable rocks, the disorienting darkness. But something pulled her forward, as if the caves themselves were singing to her, echoing with memories she didn't know she had. Inside, the walls glittered with tiny crystals that caught what little light filtered through the entrance. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, creating a haunting melody that reminded her of her grandmother's old music box. The further she ventured, the more the cave seemed to shift and change, becoming less a physical space and more a gallery of memories. Here was the summer she turned 7, learning to swim in the bay while her grandmother watched from the shore. There was her first heartbreak at 16, crying on Grandmere's shoulder while the old woman stroked her hair and hummed ancient French lullabies. And there, carved into the very stone itself, were the stories her grandmother had told her about their family's history, tales of love and loss, of magic and mundanity, of women who could speak to the sea and men who were lost to it. Chapter 4, Learning to Pretend. Dr. Chen's office was a sanctuary of calm in the chaos of Amelie's life. Located in a converted lighthouse at the edge of town, it offered a panoramic view of the bay that somehow made it easier to talk about difficult things. Tell me about the dreams, Dr. Chen said, her voice as steady as the lighthouse beam that still swept across the water every night. Are they still coming? Amelie wrapped her hands around a mug of chamomile tea, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals. Every night now. And they feel different. More real than before. Sometimes I'm not sure if I'm actually dreaming or if what? Or if something else is happening. Something I can't explain. Dr. Chen made a note in her leather-bound journal. Sometimes when we experience profound loss, our minds create coping mechanisms that can feel very real. It's not uncommon. But what if it's more than that? Amelie leaned forward. What if the stories my grandmother told me about our family, about the women in our line having a special connection to the sea, what if they weren't just stories? The therapist's expression remained neutral, professional. Do you want them to be more than stories? The question hung in the air like sea mist, refusing to dissipate. Chapter 5. The art of forgetting. Memories have a way of washing up like driftwood, appearing when you least expect them and carrying messages from a past you thought you'd left behind. For Amelie, they began arriving with the tide, fragments of conversations, glimpses of moments she'd tried to forget, pieces of herself she'd lost along the way. She found them scattered along the beach during her morning walks, a shell that reminded her of the necklace Thomas had given her on their first anniversary, a smooth piece of sea glass the exact shade of her grandmother's eyes, a water-worn piece of wood that could have come from the boat her father had sailed away in, never to return. Each object seemed to pulse with its own energy, its own story, demanding to be remembered even as the waves tried to wash them away. Dr. Chen would probably say it was her subconscious mind processing grief, but Amelie wasn't so sure. There was something deliberate about these memories, as if the sea itself was trying to tell her something. One morning, she found an old brass key half buried in the sand, its surface green with verdigris, but still somehow familiar. It took her 3 days to remember where she'd seen it before, in a dream where her grandmother had shown her a locked door in the basement of the house, a door she'd never been able to find in her waking hours. Until now. Chapter 6. Roses and Other Temporal Things. The rose garden behind the house had been her grandmother's pride and joy. Now it grew wild and untamed, the carefully cultivated hybrid teas mixing with hardy beach roses until it was impossible to tell where one variety ended and another began. Amelie had meant to tend to it, had even bought gardening gloves and pruning shears, but something always stopped her. Perhaps it was the way the roses seemed to have developed their own will, their own purpose. They grew in impossible patterns, blooming out of season and surviving salt spray that should have killed them. Sometimes, in the right light, their shadows formed patterns that looked almost like words. It was in the garden that she first saw Thomas again, 3 months after he'd left. He stood at the gate, looking older somehow, more worn around the edges. "You look different," he said by way of greeting. "So do you." She didn't move to let him in. "I've been worried about you, Amelie. You don't answer your phone, you've quit your job, people are talking." "Let them talk." She touched one of the roses, its petals soft against her fingertips. "Some things have to die before they can grow into something new." He flinched at that, and she saw in his eyes that he understood she wasn't just talking about the flowers. Chapter 7. The Language of Waves. The key from the beach fit perfectly into the lock of a door Amelie found behind an old wardrobe in the basement. The door opened onto a narrow staircase that spiraled down into darkness, the steps worn smooth by generations of feet. At the bottom, she found a room lined with shells, thousands of them, arranged in intricate patterns across the walls and ceiling. In the center stood a pedestal, and on it lay a book bound in leather that seemed to shimmer with an iridescence like mother of pearl. The book was written in a language Amelie had never seen before, yet somehow she could read it. The words seemed to shift and change as she looked at them, sometimes appearing in French, sometimes in English, sometimes in what looked like the pattern of waves on sand. It was her grandmother's grimoire, a record of everything the women in their family had learned about the sea and its magic over generations. The final entry was dated the day before her grandmother died. "To my dearest Ami, when you find this, you'll be ready. The sea has chosen you, as it chose me, and my mother before me. The dreams you've been having are not dreams at all, but memories, memories of things that haven't happened yet, of lives you haven't lived, of the person you're becoming. The shore of dreams is real. The caves hold more than just echoes. And the roses, the roses know more than they let on. Close your eyes, my darling. Let it all begin. With all my love, Grandmere, Chapter 8, the art of drowning. Learning to use her newfound abilities was like learning to swim all over again. There was a lot of flailing, a lot of swallowing water, and a lot of moments when she thought she would drown. But gradually, like a child finding their balance in the waves, Amelie began to understand. The shore of dreams wasn't just a place, it was a state of being, a way of seeing the world through the lens of possibility rather than limitation. The caves weren't just physical spaces, but portals to understanding, each chamber holding lessons for those who knew how to listen. And the roses were guardians, keeping watch over the thin places where magic seeped through into the ordinary world. Dr. Chen noticed the change in her patient but didn't comment on it directly. Instead, she asked different questions. How do you feel about your grandmother's death now? What does home mean to you? Are you still afraid of being alone? Amelie answered truthfully, but not completely. How could she explain that she was never truly alone anymore? That the sea itself had become her companion, its voices as familiar to her now as her own thoughts. Chapter 9, The Weight of Water. The storm that changed everything came on the anniversary of her grandmother's death. Amelie stood on the cliff edge, watching the clouds gather on the horizon, dark, heavy things that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The townspeople battened down their hatches and evacuated the low-lying areas, but Amelie knew she had to stay. This wasn't just any storm, it was the one her grandmother had written about in her final entries, the one that would test whether Amelie was truly ready to take her place in the long line of women who had guarded this coast. As the wind rose and the waves began to pound against the cliffs, she made her way down to the beach. The roses in the garden turned to face her as she passed, their petals glowing faintly in the gathering dark. At the water's edge, she closed her eyes and began to sing, not with her voice, but with something deeper, something that resonated with the very rhythm of the tides. The storm responded, its fury focusing on her like a spotlight. In that moment, suspended between wind and wave, past and future, fear and acceptance, Amelie finally understood what her grandmother had been trying to teach her all along. The greatest magic wasn't in controlling the storm, but in learning to dance with it. Chapter 10, All's forgotten now. The morning after the storm, Port Haven awoke to find their town mysteriously untouched. The weather service called it a miracle, a freak occurrence where the storm had split at the last moment, passing to either side of the small coastal community. Only Amelie knew the truth, and she kept it close to her heart like a precious shell. The power she'd inherited wasn't meant for show or glory, it was a quiet magic, as subtle as the movement of tides, as patient as the shaping of sea glass. Thomas came by one last time, to check on her after the storm. He found her in the rose garden, pruning away dead growth with sure, confident strokes. "You seem different," he said, and this time there was understanding in his voice rather than concern. "I am different," she replied, and smiled. "We're all different, every moment of every day. The trick is learning to love the changing." He nodded, and in his eyes she saw that he finally understood why their paths had needed to diverge. Some people were meant for solid ground, and others were called by the sea. Epilogue, the endless tide. Now, on quiet evenings, Amelie sits by her window and watches the play of light on water. The house no longer feels too big, it has become exactly what it was always meant to be, a lighthouse of sorts, a beacon for those who need to find their way home to themselves. She still sees Dr. Chen, though their sessions have evolved into something more like conversations between colleagues than therapy. Sometimes they talk about the weather, and both know they're really talking about something else entirely. The roses bloom year-round now, defying all laws of nature, and the locals have begun leaving small offerings by the garden gate, tokens for luck, for love, for safe passage across troubled waters. Amelie collects them at dawn and returns them to the sea with whispered blessings. And on special nights, when the moon is full and the tide is just right, she makes her way down to the shore of dreams. Sometimes she catches glimpses of other figures there, her grandmother, young and radiant, women in clothing from centuries past, perhaps even future guardians yet to be born. They smile and nod as she passes, these keepers of tide and time, these daughters of salt and storm. And in their eyes, she sees the truth that her grandmother tried so hard to teach her: we're all alone, yes. But we're all alone together. And that makes all the difference in the world. The end.